it's a very, very vast subject. So covering this vast subject in a very short span is going to be slightly difficult. So what I will do is provide you a bird's eye view of the marvelous technological inventions and discoveries that have guided and shaped what we now call as the World Wide Web or the internet era. Last year, right in the month of about February or so, we were struck with this COVID pandemic. It started from China, and all of us know the rest is history. It really majorly disrupted all of us, and what is now called as a new norm has now become a order of the day. And I am able to talk to you again using this new norm technology, using the new platform, the Zoom platform, which we are all connected in. Under this huge crisis that not only India, the world over, people have faced, particularly India, I mean, be it the migrant laborers or all of us, people losing their jobs, there is only one silver lining that has actually helped us to still keep kicking. That is the technology, the internet, and that have taken place in this technology. I have used this particular slide majorly because it is very early in the during the pandemic time, just about the 12th May. The farmer was able to connect to their market using the technology, internet technology. These days, words like Google, Zoom have become so very, very common that whether somebody is educated, not educated, these words are in the lexicon of every single individual. So that's perhaps in a way has been able to connect us or keep us still kicking and overcome slightly the pains that we have all had to go through. The COVID pandemic was a major disruption for the Nehru Science Center as well. Since its opening in 1985, there has not been a single day when the museum was closed. Normally, we close only 2 days in a year to the public, that is on Holi and Deepavali. We work even on national holidays like Independence Day, Republic Day, Mahatma Gandhiji's birthday. So every visitor eagerly waits to come and see the Science Center, which again is an outcome of all the support that we receive from scientific institutions, primarily, of course, the BARC and the Atomic Energy. I'm sure most of you must be remembering very recently, just last year, before the lockdown began, we had a major exhibition called as the Mega Science Exhibition or Vigyan Samagama, which was again done in collaboration with Atomic Energy. So there has been a continuous connect between the Nehru Science Center and the Department of Atomic Energy. So when this struck us and when we are not able to connect the museum with the people, we again had to find our own ways to remain connected with the audience. And we use this technology of internet and computers to get connected. I will just give you just about in 30 seconds, I'll run you through the kind of a program that we have done during this lockdown times. For example, we had speakers from all over not just from Mumbai in India, but also globally. On each of the occasions, we had some of the best speakers connected to our audience. These are some of the programs. We had several of our science demonstrations, workshops, then what we call as a Science Quest, lockdown lecture series. The number of students who got involved with our activities online is unprecedented. We never expected that earlier when the students only used to come here for taking part in the workshop. But now what happened is there was an interesting thing that happened. The child was always joined by one of the parents. Sometimes it is the father who has joined us. It is a very interesting thing. Under normal circumstances, the father goes to the workplace, whereas perhaps the mother sometimes used to come here. This is one place during which we found that the father was also joining the kids majorly. So this is one, the spin-off among the bad conditions. Perhaps these are some of the small spin-off benefits as well of the pandemic. We also connected our audience to the sky observation. We had lots and lots of sky observation program. I'm very happy to inform you that we had audience joining us from not only from India, but also from throughout the world. this was a very interesting thing that we were able to connect, particularly the Gulf countries. There were a lot of Indians, perhaps the expats who are there in the Gulf, majorly, of course, the Kerala expats. They all joined us and they were very happy to participate with us in these sky observation programs. Okay, then how is this that this has come to be? And where are we in the place of IT in the world? Now, there is one beautiful book which was actually supported by Tata Consultancy, written by Mr. Shivanand Kanvi. It talks about from sand to silicon. He covers the Indian contribution to the field of Silicon Valley. I would recommend that you may like to read this. It's freely available also, I think, in the PDF format. He talks about several unsung IT heroes who have contributed to the growth of Silicon Valley in US. It's kind of a very interesting thing. In the IT world, they use the term Satyam Shivam Sundaram. This was one film by Raj Kapoor, Satyam Shivam Sundaram. So these are the three people. Satyam, for example, Satya Nadella, who is the chief of Microsoft. Shivam is, of course, Shiv Nadar, who is the chief of HCL. And Sundaram, again, Sundar Pichai, who is the chief of Google. So Satyam Shivam Sundaram of the IT world belong to India. So you can imagine the kind of a connect order that India has when it comes to IT. During the presidential campaign that Barack Obama did, he, when he was addressing his electorates in Buffalo, he used the term that, I will ensure that you will not lose your jobs to Bangalore. The word Bangalore has now become a word. If somebody in US or some developing countries lose their job to Indians, it's called Bangalore. So this is the kind of a connect that we Indians have as far as harvesting the benefits of these IT technologies. But then how did these IT technologies and the current era, how have we landed into this current era? The history of every great invention is based on a lot of prehistory. And this is succinctly told by Voltaire, who says, history consists of a series of accumulated imaginative inventions. So I will just briefly touch through what are these accumulated imaginative inventions that have led us to the current era, where we can virtually, notwithstanding the physical or the social distance that we are mandated to maintain during the COVID times, we are yet kicking in. I mean, I don't think any of the students have lost their academic excellence, because they have not only heard their teachers connecting with them over the platform of Zoom or any other platforms virtually, but also there is so much of content, scholarly content, which is available on the net, on YouTube, on several other media, on educational institutions, universities, sitting in their own comfortable houses. One can actually get this information. Now, how did this come here? The digital, wireless technology and internet, like I told you, they're all inextricably linked to our everyday lives, more so during the COVID pandemic. It's again, it's a welcome change that the broadband connection has majorly changed the system, and there are private players coming in, the public sectors, all of them coming in to play a major role to provide the digital technology services at the very doorsteps of all individuals. The mobile revolution, for example, the smartphones which was kicked in by Steve Jobs with his Apple iPhones, that has helped that you, in your hand you have a computer with which you can access and listen to all these lectures. Talking about wireless, I think we Indians should be very proud that the genesis of wireless actually should go to Jagdish Chandra Bose. Unfortunately, it is Marconi who has not only got the Nobel Prize, but also the whole world over recognizes him. But during the centenary, 1997 or 98, IEEE actually corrected their opinion. And what they said is that wireless was actually introduced by Jagdish Chandra Bose. We all know, especially this August audience will know that J.C. Bose for the first time demonstrated his wireless technology by sitting in one room of his presidency college. In the other room, you had, he was able to fire the gun remotely. That was the beginning of what we now call as a wireless technology. And for that, we should owe our gratitude to Jagdish Chandra Bose. And he not only was responsible for this, but he also devised his own devices, the coherer, for example, which is the application of which was extensively used during the pre-internet era, and the telegraphic and telephone connection that we had. His technology was extensively used, particularly for transmission of the telegraphic signals. But then before I go on to the world stage as to what exactly the internet and revolutionary development that have taken place, I would like to briefly talk about two major events in the history of India. One was, these are all very recent events, not very, very long ago. 1986 is the period when I joined this government service. Now, that was the time when, for the first time, a public rural automatic exchange was commissioned in a place called Kittur, and it just had about 512 extensions. Now, this was the beginning. I'm sure most of you who are, because this is a association of the retirees, every one of you will be remembering that in those days, right up to the 90s, all of us used to go and stand in a long queue waiting for 11 o'clock. After 11 o'clock, we had 1/4 telephone charges. So most of us never had any telephone at residence. So such was the condition. Fortunately, all that changed courtesy a government company, a Center for Development of Telematics, CDOT, and CDOT indigenously designed and developed that rural automatic exchange, which was first commissioned in a place called Kittur. It was able to sustain that heat of 45 degrees centigrade in Kittur. The next revolution came up in August 1995, 15th August to be precise. Incidentally, this 2020 was the silver jubilee of internet connections in India. But when it all began by one man, Mr. Brijendra Singhal, who has written a beautiful book on this, for the first one full year, it was so very bad. The connection was terribly bad, and we had about 48 kbps modem connection, dial-up modem connection, and it was there only in 4 places. Even Bangalore did not have the internet connection. If they have to connect to internet, Bangalore had to dial an STD and connect either to Delhi or to Calcutta or to Mumbai. So such was the case in 1995, and there were major complaints. But then Singhal again, to be fair to him, he left his very lucrative job and came and joined Videsh Sanchar Nigam Limited to usher in what we now call as the internet era for India. Then just think about the importance of digital technology. We have about, it's a very moderate estimation, 3.6 billion smartphone users globally, 500 million plus smartphone users in India, 300 billion email messages exchanged daily. This is the kind of a traffic that is there on the internet, and that has been made possible by scientists and technologists. Another best part of it is all the intellectual resources generated all across the world. They are now just a click away, somewhere there sitting in the cloud. Each one of us, the children in particular, the future citizens in particular, they can all access that information and help in the knowledge economy that we are all a part of. Now, these are some of the internet users. If you go by just 2012, we just had about 137 million internet users in India. 2019 is 500 million visitors, users. I'm sure this number must have drastically increased, particularly during the COVID pandemic times. By 2025, it says that India could create a digital economy of $800 billion to $1 trillion, as per the IT Ministry report. This is the kind of economic impact that internet can provide. These are some of the other important information that just 10% rise in the internet penetration. It is estimated that it can increase GDP by about 1.08%. It can, and for every single job lost, I'm sure all of us, the old timers, will remember during the Morarji Desai government time, when IBM was thrown out and the people were all fighting against introduction of computers. even now there are some people, some naysayers who are afraid of losing jobs. But then there is an interesting data here. For every one job lost because of the internet, there are 2.6 jobs created. So this is a kind of a disruption that this digital economy, internet has brought about. And I'm sure we will partake in this majorly, primarily because we also have an advantage of English being a language where we are all very comfortable. Particularly the South Indians, this platform, Atomic Energy Retirees Association of Kerala, the students who have joined. So in a way that English also will help us to join this bandwagon. I will not cover this because there is so much. This is the data based on ITU telecommunications, the kind of internet penetration that has happened. You can see almost about even in developing countries, per 100, it was initially very, very low. We now have about 47 people per 100 connected, whereas in the developed countries, it's almost 90% of the people who are connected to internet. But it is increasing by leaps and bounds exponentially, for example. But then how did this come here? These developments can be broken up into these components: development in computing, digital revolution, modern computers, developments in communication, and the birth of internet and World Wide Web. It all started, of course, with what we call as a human flesh computers. The word computer is, again, it derives its genesis from the Greek, from Latin, if I'm not wrong. Computers means a person who is actually computing. The computers, all those people who were actually involved in calculations and computing, they were all called as computers in the initial period, right up to the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century also. The people who were involved in this were called as computers. That's why that is an era of flesh calculations, or human people were calculating that. Then came, of course, this major disruption, the calculation of the number system, a decimal place value system, which of course India has made a major contribution. Talking about the decimal place value system, the zero plays a major role in digital technology, 0 and 1. So again, I think there is some kind of an India connect in this. The first mechanical calculator is by a gentleman called as Blaise Pascal. I am not talking about the earlier abacus and the Napier's bones and things like that. But first, truly speaking, a calculator was by a French by name Pascal. Blaise Pascal. He produced Pascaline. I will talk about that. Then came another interesting thing known as Leibniz ready reckoner. Then we had the punch cards, and of course Charles Babbage, who is called as the father of computers. Talking about the decimal place value system, until very recently we were all under the impression, and then all of us used to tell that zero dates back to about 500 during the Aryabhata's time, about 500 AD or so. But that is not the case. Very recently, there was an exhibition in London Science Museum, Illuminating India, 5,000 Years of Science, Technology and Innovation. In that exhibition, what you see here is this Bakhshali manuscript, which is in the possession of, it is there in Oxford Library. This was actually first time brought out and placed in the museum for the first time for the public. Before they could put it as an exhibit, what they did is they have tried to date this document. And when they dated it, very surprisingly, it dates back to 2nd or 3rd century. That means what we thought that zero began somewhere in the 6th or 7th century Christian era. That's not the case. It actually goes back by another 200 to 300 years back. So zero in India began somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd century. Interestingly enough, we take this decimal place value system for granted, but that was not the case. Right up to the 12th or 13th century, when the Renaissance took place in majorly in Italy and France and things like that, the merchants actually had to went on a massive strike. These merchants wanted to use the Indian number system. They of course they used to call as the Arab number system, but the Christian rule, they all told that no, you have to use the Roman numbers. Via media was worked out by Fibonacci. In fact, Fibonacci played a mediator role and told that let the accountants and those people, shopkeepers, use the number system. But this number system, when it is used in legal parlance, it should be only the Roman numbers. That is the reason when you go to the Gateway of India in South Mumbai there, you will find that on the Gateway of India, the numbers the year is mentioned in Roman numbers. Even today, in most of the European buildings, British buildings and European buildings, you find these Roman numbers used. But when it comes to using in economy, they always use the Arab numerals, which now have become, the world knows that it went from India. The first of the calculators actually, came as a very interesting spin-off benefit. In the sense, Blaise Pascal, when he was a very small child, he used to see that his father was some kind of a clerk working in a shop. Every day he used to immerse himself in mechanical calculations, and he hardly had any time for his son. So Blaise Pascal thought that, why should my father be so involved in calculating some numbers? Can this work not be done by some kind of a machine? So with this concept, he started that and then came out with this beautiful mechanical calculator, which was able to add and subtract two numbers directly and multiply and divide by repetition. So these mechanical calculators are Pascaline, which they are called as Pascaline. They are now there even today in some of the museums in France. The next important revolutionary changes came about with Leibniz. Leibniz is also, he's the man actually who should be given credit for calculus. Of course, we give it to Newton. But the fact of the matter is Leibniz should also be credited for invention of the calculus. Very interestingly, he not only came out with this beautiful, it's a kind of an art piece. If you look at earlier mechanical or any of these devices, they themselves are artistically very, very elegant. So this is the replica of the Strep Reckoner, which actually was an improvement on the Blaise Pascal's Pascaline calculating machine. What is very interesting thing about Leibniz is that he said, it is unworthy of excellent men to lose hours like slaves in the labor of calculation, which could safely be relegated to anyone else if machines were used. Now, in the current era of artificial intelligence, this actually resonates very well. When trivial things can be done by a machine, why should men waste their time in this? So this was a profound statement that he made. Of course, then next we come to this man, Charles Babbage, who is called as the father of computers. He actually produced two machines. One was a differential engine, other one was the analytical engine. He was the first man to actually think about the concept of a modern computers. We all know what a modern computer is, but thinking about a modern computer in the early period, late into the early 19th century and middle of the 19th century, is extremely difficult because the mechanical engineering was not so very well developed as to be in sync with Charles Babbage's thoughts. Unfortunately, notwithstanding his geniusness, he was not able to succeed in making his analytical engine a successful one. All of us scientists should actually learn one thing from Charles Babbage. He not only was a genius, but he knew how to actually put up proposals to get funding. When people used to find it difficult to get even maybe 100 pounds, 200 pounds, he managed to get 10,000 pounds as grant in aid for this analytical engine because he was extremely good at that. I think most of the scientists in these days, you may have some of the best possible thoughts in mind, but then perhaps somewhere we are not very successful in convincing the funding authorities to fund our projects. So I think this we must learn from Charles Babbage. There's a lot written about Charles Babbage and how he was able to succeed in this. I think for this August gathering, I would request you may like to touch up on these things. The next revolutionary changes came up with this man, Hermann Hollerith. It was a time when, in US also they used to have this census system. And every decade they used to count the census of the people with some little additional data in addition to the number of people, Janasankhya. But that census itself used to take about 7 to 8 years. So this man, Hermann Hollerith, I think there is an apocryphal belief, not anecdotal, of course, that he actually saw his father-in-law his father-in-law was a tram conductor, and every time, he used to, when traveling in a tram, when you take a ticket, you see a punch card being punched. So he thought, what is it that the punch keeps changing from one location to other location? If you're traveling X distance, you get one punch. If you're traveling Y distance, you get another punch. So from that, he got an idea that the punch itself can act as some kind of a data. So he used this punch system and developed this what he called as a punch card tabulating and sorting machine, which was majorly successful. And the work, which is to take about 8 to 10 years for the census, he was able to complete it in just about 2 years or 2.5 years. And he also saved a lot of money to the government of US. So interestingly, this Harman Hollerith tabulating machine company went on to become the famous IBM company. Even today, IBM is very well known. IBM is known for, they introduced a lot of things. And in the initial period, actually, IBM went on to win 3 Nobel Prizes also. So Harman Hollerith should be given a credit for starting a company which became IBM. All of us know about this, the first, what we call it, the digital computer, ENIAC. Before ENIAC, I'm not going into the vacuum tubes. I'm sure some of the scientists from BRC must have used these vacuum tubes in your heydays. This ENIAC machine used to use tens and thousands of these vacuum tubes. The machine was primarily aimed at calculating making some calculation so that they were able to fire cannons during the World War. But it so happened that it was not successful. The machine could not be produced before so that it could be used in the World War. But again, it's a piece of history. 1946 was the time when this first electronic computers, which was called as a giant brain, came into being. The next version of this ENIAC, I'm sure some of you have heard, UNIVAC. UNIVAC came from Princeton University. And interestingly, TIFR, Department of Atomic Energy and TIFR are inextricably linked with each other. Even in TIFR, when UNIVAC computers were being developed in Princeton, just about within 3-4 years, TIFR produced their first computer as big, something not as big as this, slightly smaller, and which was called as TIFRAC. I'm sure some of you must be knowing about the TIFRAC. The major credit for the modern day, what we call as in the true sense of computers or artificial intelligence, must go to this man. You can imagine the kind of a statement that he made in the 1940s. You can see that statement there. There will positively be no internal alteration within the bracket of the computer to be made, even if we wish suddenly to switch from calculating the energy levels of the neon atom to the enumeration of the group of order 720. It may appear somewhat puzzling that this can be done. How can one expect a machine to do all this multitudinous variety of things? The answer is that we should consider the machine to be doing something quite simple, namely carrying out orders given to it in a standard form, which is able to understand. Basically, what we call as a programming the machines is something which he envisaged when there was nothing. The concept of a programming was not there. He is also the man who should be credited for cracking that Enigma code. The Germans used to transmit their codes so he was able to decipher those Enigma things, and he was very, very successful. Another interesting thing is that we are now talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and things like that. Alan Turing actually was far ahead of his times. He thought about this artificial intelligence and machine learning, etc. The next slide, I will show you that. But before I tell you that, Alan Turing has a very interesting connect with India. Alan Turing's father was an Indian civil service officer. He was working in the Madras presidency. I'm sure he must have traveled to Kerala as well. And his mother's father was an engineer. He was working in Tungabhadra Dam. If you really, in Karnataka, you have this Tungabhadra Dam. That Tungabhadra Dam was actually designed by Alan Turing's grandfather, mother's father. It is also said that Alan Turing's brother was born in India, but it is said that he was perhaps conceived in India, but he was born in England. See the statement, what he said, computing machinery and intelligence He says he had an idea that computers would become so powerful that they would think. He envisaged a time when artificial intelligence would be a reality. But how would you know if a machine was intelligent? He devised the Turing test. He said, a judge sitting at a computer terminal types questions to two entities, one a person and the other a computer. The judge decides which entity is human, which the computer. If the judge is wrong, the computer has passed the Turing test and is intelligent. I'm sure all of you will be able to understand this when we, think of Siri, the Google machine, the talking machine, artificial intelligence, all these things. This all the statement that he made in 1950, 70 years, they have proved to be prophetic. His statement was truly prophetic, and they have now come true. This was a revolutionary change in terms of computers. The concept of a transistor, it was revolutionary because, replacing a vacuum tube with a small device became one of the changing, path-breaking things in the field of digital technology. And the credit for this should go to three people. All the three of them won the Nobel Prize: John Bardeen, William Shockley, and Walter Brattain. You can see the man who is sitting is the youngest of them all, and had actually no role whatsoever in the point contact transistor which they had invented. Although the concept of a transistor was the idea of William Shockley, who was par excellence genius. But then it was his project. He was working with AT&T Bell Labs, and he had invited two physicists, Walter Brattain and John Bardeen. Of course, Bardeen won second Nobel Prize as well. William Shockley was not able to, achieve the success, but his partners managed to produce what is called as a point contact transistor. Shockley was not at all very happy about it because he thought that it was his idea, but somehow the credit for this went to his partners, John Bardeen and Walter Brattain. Incidentally, when AT&T Bell Lab announced this in the press also, and even for the patent, it went in their names and in the AT&T Bell laboratory. And Shockley was nowhere involved in that. So he was very annoyed with that. And as it is, he was a very kind of a cracky gentleman. He was never ever satisfied with his people. So he thought this has no future at all. So he came out with what is known as the junction transistors. So all of us, even today, the billions and billions of transistors are embedded in the integrated chip, but all of that use what is called as the junction transistors. Again, Shockley, for the next 5-6 years, this was invented in 1947, 48. He stayed with AT&T Bell Lab for another 5-6 years. But then because of his, he did not get a promotion in AT&T Bell Labs. And they did not also agree to whatever he was suggesting. He decided that there is no career for him in AT&T Bell Labs, so he has to go. So he shifted from the East Coast and went to the West Coast. Now, what we see as a Silicon Valley, the father of Silicon Valley is actually William Shockley. This was the William Shockley. He came here to what we now call as Silicon Valley. He started a company known as Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory. And this was the place where all these things started. Even today, if you go to US on the Silicon Valley, you find this on this road, symbolizing the role that junction transistors have played in the formation of the Silicon Valley. But then William Shockley had some innate gift. He was able to identify talents. So he identified 8 great talents to work for him in Shockley Semiconductors. So these are the people whom he engaged. You can see here, Gordon Moore, Sheldon Roberts, Eugene Clair, Robert Noyce, Victor Greenwich, Julius Planck, Gene Horney, and J. Last. These are the 8 people whom William Shockley appointed them, and all of them were working for Shockley Semiconductors. Very interestingly, Shockley also knew that the people have to come from diverse fields. It is not only physicists. You need to have a physicist, you need to have a chemist, you need to have a metallurgist, you also need to have some engineers. So the group consisted of a variety of experts, similar to what BRC is. BRC has experts in all fields. So it is the collective efforts of all these fields together that actually produces a product which is of essence to an industry. That's what he actually realized. But the only problem with William Shockley is that he was not able to, appreciate the genius of his prodigies. He always expected them to work the way he wanted them to work. So one fine day, all these 8 people together left that company and started their own company. So William Shockley called these people as the treacherous 8. I would request you to please try and read what this treacherous 8 is. It's a very interesting story. Now, the story also that when you have a bad boss, bad boss also sometimes can create some wonderful things. So this is an outcome of that. So all these people together left Shockley Semiconductors and started a company known as Fairchild company. I'm sure the retired scientists will remember during the 60s, most of the ICs that came, 60s, 70s, 80s also, they all were from a company called as Fairchild. So this is the company's logo, Fairchild logo. And it so happened that was the time when there was a Cold War going on between Russia, the erstwhile USSR and USA, space war also going on. So millions and millions of these transistors were produced by Fairchild company. You can see the number of people who are working here, majorly ladies. So in a way, this semiconductor industry also brought about that revolutionary change of gender equity. There are 2 technologies which have brought this gender equity. One was the typewriter. I'm sure you will remember that when the typewriter was introduced, a lot of these ladies came into the main workforce. Similarly, when transistors came into being, many of these ladies started working in the IT industry. The very interesting thing is that one of the 8 people who deserted Shockley is a gentleman by name Eugene Kleiner. I'm talking about this because he was the first man, because these people did not know how to get money for funding their project. He went to a banker known as Mr. Rock and got money to found a company called as the Fairchild. But today, what we call as venture capital has become a big norm. Everyone talks about the venture capital. The concept of this venture capital actually started by these 8 people, the treacherous 8 people, when they started the Fairchild Semiconductors. You can imagine, I'm sure you all know the company's name, Kleiner Perkins, a venture capital firm, which has actually funded giant companies like Amazon, Google, and Sun Microsystems. Each of them are billion dollar companies. So the concept of venture capital was also an outcome of a company called as Fairchild. Interestingly, these 8 people who started Fairchild Semiconductors, from Fairchild, people kept jumping from one job to the other. So there were so many companies which came up in Silicon Valley. You can see some of the names. Shockley Labs, for example, gave to Fairchild Semiconductor, National Semiconductor, Signetics, Linear Technology. All these companies were an outcome of one single company. People left one job to the other job, and now if there is any innovation that is taking place, disruption that is taking place in the Silicon Valley, it is primarily because of these people and their way of giving that freedom of creativity, encouraging knowledge-based economy, things like that. So the Silicon Valley that we see is totally liberal in terms of you can take huge amount of risk to start that. So all that thing, the credit must go to William Shockley and the way he was able to identify people. One of the companies started as an outcome of this is Intel. Now, all of us know what the role of Intel is. And 2 people, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, they were the 2 people who were actually selected by Shockley to start this company. So in a way, the Silicon Valley that you see, whether it is Oracle, Twitter, all those, Google, Yahoo, all these companies owe their genesis, the Facebook, for example, to one single company, that is Shockley Semiconductors and William Shockley. Then we shift forward and come to a place where, there were transistors being used in large numbers, but then again, it was not able to shrink the size. The next revolutionary changes came up with the introduction of what is known as the integrated chip. Although the credit for invention of the chip goes to Jack Kilby, Robert Noyce also should get the credit, because the ICs that we are all using today owe their genesis to the technology that Robert Noyce developed for his company, Fairchild Semiconductors. Interestingly, this Jack Kilby got the Nobel Prize for invention of this chip in the year 2000. For those school students who have joined us, I would like to tell you that he was able to come out with this product of a integrated chip during his vacation time. He had joined a company known as Texas Instruments, and during those days, anybody who is joining new is not given a paid holiday during the Christmas time. So he was supposed to work in the company and did not get paid holidays. During those time when he had no senior, he tried to do something on his own, with his own concept thinking, to integrate, for example, a transistor, a capacitor, a resistor, everything put together. And then this is what the outcome. The first integrated chip was formed during those 25 days of vacation time that others enjoyed. So for those of you youngsters, school and college going students, you can create something new if you have a novel idea. He was also known for, he had only girls as his children. He was very, very happy. And he proudly used to say, Kilby specialized in girls because he always loved girls. The one single sentence of the founders of ENIAC mainframe computer succinctly defines the impact the miniaturization has brought. Eckert says, "It is shocking to have your life work reduced to a tenth of a square inch of silicon." What he meant is that they produced their ENIAC machine, toiling years and years, and then suddenly in comes this new technology, and you can bring down the shape of that huge computer into just one small square inch of space. So we can imagine now any of these modern microprocessors, they are so small, but they're able to calculate, or maybe they are more powerful than those early computers. It was during that time that Gordon Moore actually published a popular article where he said that the number of components that will be integrated will keep doubling and the price will come down by half. That he said in 1965, and that Moore's law is holding good today also. This is even today, the IC designers are actually considering the Moore's law as a prime mover in terms of trying to shrink more and more number of components, electronic components, into the ICs. The next revolutionary step came with a company called as Intel. Intel, again, primarily the company was formed to produce memory chips, nothing more than memory chips. They were primarily meant for preparing memory because memory was very, very costly. Memory, they used to use those cores, some of us must have seen that. They were very expensive. So Intel was formed to produce memory chips. Then suddenly, one fine day, they got an interesting offer from a Japanese company called as Busicom. Busicom came to Intel and said that they want to produce one calculator which should be the best calculator in the industry. Nobody should be able to compete with this calculator. So they thought about that, and there was one gentleman. I showed you this gentleman, Ted Hoff, for example. He was the leader of this project. He thought that he did not go by the idea or the suggestion that was given to him either by his bosses or by the people from Japan, the Busicom calculator. He thought that I should be able to produce one single chip which has got its own processor, which has got its own input, which has got its own memory, which has got its own output. What he called it as the first general purpose microprocessor. So he was successful in producing a 4-bit microprocessor which contained about 2,200 transistors and other devices put together. So this was a turning point. I think some of you must be aware, must be knowing the Intel 4004 or the next one is Intel 8080, the 8-bit microprocessors. They were actually the revolutionary change makers in terms of IT. Interestingly enough, they did use this thing and produce this wonderful calculator which used the microprocessors produced by Intel. Visicom company was not very sure what the utility of these microprocessors were, but Robert Noyce, the founder of Intel, a genius at that, he was sure that this microprocessor is going to completely revolutionize. So he thought that the copyright or the patentship of this microprocessor should not be given to the Japanese company. So the Intel company brought the patent from Visicom for $60,000. Now it is history. Intel is inextricably linked with microprocessors, and they are the leaders of the world. When they actually wanted to diversify into microprocessors, there were own internal people who were telling that we are meant for memory devices. Let us not go into microprocessors. But then you can see now, had they stuck to their own traditional ideas of producing only memories, perhaps Intel would not have been a company that it has become now. So one has to be open to changes. Then comes a very important turning point where computers, which were majorly focused on research labs, universities, they become personal, so that individuals can own this system. And that personal thing was primarily made possible by a company called as Apple. Steve Jobs, I'm sure all of us know his name. Unfortunately, he's no longer there. He's meant for the man who actually is famously known for disrupting the market. And then his partner, Steve Wozniak. Then, of course, we have this Intel, Microsoft, and IBM. All these companies put together, they actually brought a system known as the personal computing. Talking about Steve Jobs, when AT&T Bell Labs produced those transistors, a new company was formed, which became a global company. I think all of us know the Sony company. Sony began their business using those transistors which were produced by Bell Labs, and they produced those Sony transistors, which radios. From that, the Sony became such a big company. But what did this man do? Steve Jobs was always known for disrupting that. Sony produced those Walkman tape recorders. His one iPod completely disbanded the Sony market. So, the word disruption or one new product completely changing the market, the genesis of that goes to this man, Steve Jobs. Interestingly enough, Steve Jobs, though not an engineer or a scientist by himself, was very good at identifying the technology. What we now call as a graphical user interface, or the mouse that all of us use, the 3-button mouse. Actually, it is not the invention of either Apple or IBM. This was actually the invention of a company called like Xerox, which used to produce reprographics. But this Steve Jobs went and saw these two things there. He bought those rights from him, and rest is history. The graphical user interface and mouse are there all over now. And it is again Steve Jobs who disrupted the market by bringing iPhone. Now, all of us have smartphones. Everybody is using the smartphones to browse, to join on Zoom. That is again courtesy this Steve Jobs. I have already talked to you about how this IBM, Intel, and Microsoft came together. Basically, one producing hardware, one producing the microprocessors, the other one producing the software. They all come together, and what we now call as the personal computers came about because of the collaboration that IBM, Intel, and Microsoft had. Simultaneously, when this was happening, just before that, there was a revolution taking place in communication, and that first revolution happened because of the transatlantic cable, which goes back to during the period of about 1958 or 1858 or something, around the 1898 or so. In 1957, 4th October 1957, the Americans were in for a huge shock. Russia, USSR actually bet them and placed this Sputnik in space. That was the time when they were very worried about, the Hiroshima, Nagasaki had happened in 1945, the atomic bomb. So there was some kind of a Cold War going on between Russia, USSR and USA. When the Russians launched this Sputnik, they came, I mean, they were very, very worried. What happens? Suddenly, it gave a major impetus for the technological developments in US. President Eisenhower started a new project known as Advanced Research Project Analysis. Although it started in 1958, it became ARPANET and DARPA ARPANET in 1969 and DARPA in Defense Advanced Research Project in 1972. What the project envisaged was that both the private government and the universities, all their computers should all be networked. In case there is any failure of one somebody's machines going bad, there should be another parallel system which should work. With that concept, the ARPANET was started so that Russians would not have a higher hand in the technology. Then comes this is the beginning of this internet now. I've just rushed through this because we don't have time. There's a gentleman by name Licklider. He gave the first paper. What he produced was online man-computer communication. Till now, we had computers, we had man. There was no communication between the man and the computer. The concept of online man-computer communication was brought about by this gentleman, Licklider. And what he called is, he envisaged what is called as a galactic computer network. So there should be a galaxy of computers which are all networked and are able to connect and talk to the human beings. And this, he thought, should be globally interconnected. That there was no word internet. What he used the term known as interneting, so which ultimately became internet. So from that early stage of ARPANET, gradually things changed, and it became it went on from one place to other. Telnet, Usenet, FTP, all these things developed very, very rapidly. Again, the Licklider spoke about this in 1968. In the first system, what has to happen is how does the man, machine, and man connect, or how do they talk to each other? So they needed a technology to be produced, and that technology was produced by a company called as BBN. It is known as Interface Message Processors, IMP. So using this IMP, the man and machine was able to talk to each other irrespective of the platform in which they were using. There was no standardization that time. I mean, each of the universities perhaps could have their own software, own operating system. So this IMP was able to connect or interface and make each of these things to talk. So the first connection happened between three institutions. One was at Stanford Research Institute. Other one was Santa Barbara University, and the University of in Salt Lake. All these three companies together for the first time started talking to each other, hooked on one line using a 50 kbps line. And the main person who is to be credited for this is a gentleman by name Klenrock. There was another gentleman by name Bob Kahn. He was working for BBN, who actually produced that IMP. With all this system, they were able to actually connect three of these things. And initially it was told that there was a gentleman sitting on the telephone and talking to other. When you press L here, in other computers, that L should be seen on the screen. So they wanted to produce type log. Unfortunately, when LO was typed, the whole system crashed. The first words to be communicated on internet was low. Lo and behold, from that low, we have now come to an era of where anything and everything can be communicated. Okay, now there is another protocol, because all the computers have their own systems. So you have to have a standard protocols. So this man, who is called as the father of internet, Vint Cerf and Robert Kahn, together developed a set of protocols called as, I'm sure everybody knows this now, Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol. So it is this TCP/IP which is the binding factor for billions of computers being connected all across the globe. So that is the reason why Vint Cerf is called as the father of internet, because of his path-breaking protocol which they developed, TCP/IP. Then you have this sign of @ for sending emails. Again, it was started somewhere in the 1973 by a gentleman known as Ray Tomlinson. Then we come to WWW. All of us know CERN, especially the Atomic Energy Department of Atomic Energy, who majorly has a collaboration with CERN in the, especially in the Large Hadron Collider project. This gentleman, Tim Berners-Lee, he's not a scientist working in CERN. He's basically an engineer. What he thought is, can I try to develop a protocol where the scientists who are actually exchanging emails in CERN are able to use this more efficiently. That ultimately led to what is known as a hypertext, use of hypertext, and the first birth of WWW came about as a spin-off benefit of CERN. So when some people question, why do you invest so much money either in nuclear energy or space, we must know that there are lots and lots of spin-off benefit. One of the spin-off benefit of CERN is World Wide Web, which every individual 7 billion people in this continent on Earth are using this. So this man is Tim Berners-Lee, credited with this WWW. I'll just rush through. We have a WWW, but then how do you browse the net? So the first web browser, all of us are very used to browsing through this Google Chrome, but the first browser to be brought about was a browser known as Mozilla, and it was produced by a gentleman by name Mark Anderson. Okay, I'll just rush through. He is the man who is to be credited for making it very, very easy for each one of us to browse through the internet. Till such time, internet was still in the hands of the government of US. But in 1990, a separate backbone known as the Internet Society was formed, majorly funded by National Science Foundation. Now we know that internet is not owned by anybody. It's just a society owned by everyone. So what we call as the democratization of information is maintained because of the Internet Society. From 1995 till now, if you really see exponential growth that has taken place, the number of websites started growing by leaps and bounds. From initial period of 300 to millions and billions of things. And in between, two Stanford students, Jerry Yang and David Filo, they produced the first company of searching, what is known as Yahoo. Now, all of us know about Yahoo, at least the old timers. Now, of course, we have Google. But the first company which helped us in actually finding or searching was produced by two youngsters, these two people, again, working for Stanford. I have used this man because till such time, email was not democratized. People were not able to use email for their own individual purpose. This Sabir Bhatia from BITS Pilani, he started Hotmail, and rest is history. He sold his Hotmail company to Microsoft Bill Gates for $400 million. And again, Yahoo, no, nobody knows about the name Yahoo. These are the two young students, Stanford, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who produced Google. Google now it's everybody in the Google is a word which is known to every single person. So again, they were young students working for Stanford, and Google, the very meaning of Google is 10 to the power 100, and Google is used by maybe that many number of people all across the world. During our times, we used to use Encyclopedia Britannica, very, very expensive. None of us could afford that. Somebody has to go to the library. Now there is a Wikipedia. It is the encyclopedia produced by a collective wisdom of the people of the country, people of the globe. So today, the quality of information that is produced by Wikipedia is marvelous. Not from the research point of view, but general point of view, Wikipedia is the primary encyclopedia for people, which again was started by Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger. Similarly, these are some of the shortcuts. I'll think just rush through this one. And Facebook, the social networking, again, an young man who was working with Harvard, he started a company called Facebook, and Microsoft actually wanted to buy him, but that did not happen. So Facebook is one of the big giants now. He started from just as a college going student. So for those students who are there, who want to take on the entrepreneur job, you must study the internet, history of internet. Then again, you have this YouTube. Sir told me that my talk will be recorded and placed on YouTube. So you have hundreds and thousands of excellent lectures on YouTube. It came out in 2005 by these three people. I'll just rush through, sir. Of course, next is Twitter in 2006. These young Turks, everybody very young people in the age of 25 to 30, they go on to produce one of the most profoundly successful companies in Silicon Valley. So there is a lesson for youngsters that if you have an idea, I'm sure, and with the technology available, with the amount of information that reaches us, you can succeed. So, I mean, the number of websites that are growing, they are actually following Moore's law. I will not say anything. I've only talked to you about the kind of a benefit that are there with internet, but then there are societal issues, ethical issues, cyber security crimes, pornography. So, like every technology has got its own flip side. There are flip sides to the internet as well. But then, I mean, plus and minus have to be taken together. But if we don't change, if we don't adapt to change, we will wind up. On the origin of species, I'm reminded of this. Charles Darwin always told that there has to be change. You have to adapt to new changes, and that's what the technology should do. If we don't adapt to changes, what happened to this Kodak company? They were perhaps the largest company in US. It became bankrupt because they were not able to adapt to the digital technology. Digital camera actually became it was responsible for making this company bankrupt. And most strangely, ironically, the digital camera was invented by the company, by Kodak itself, but they never imagined that that can make a major change. They did not adapt and they winded up. So what I will say is there are huge amount of concerns which come with the internet. There are lots of benefits also, but then we have to weigh these things together. And I'm reminded of one statement. With this statement, I will end. There are benefits and concerns. The bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and notwithstanding to go to meet it. So let's weigh all these things, and then ultimately, what we see as a disruption and which has made this possible, we should all be grateful to all those people, the movers and shakers who have shaped this technology. Thank you.